I helped my father-in-law start a business because he always complained that he had nothing. I invested my money, connections, and time. And then he simply threw me out of the company, stating that family matters are not about business. He thought I would leave quietly. But I don't take back what belongs to me. I burn it to the ground. The day I proposed to Melissa, rain poured down on us like some cosmic sign. Standing there on the Brooklyn Bridge, soaked to the bone, should have seen it for what it was, a warning. But all I saw was her smile, bright against the gray sky, as she said yes. I met Richard, Melissa's father, at our engagement dinner at Salvatore's, an upscale Italian place in Manhattan. He had this way of shaking your hand that seemed friendly on the surface, but there was something calculating behind his eyes. A handshake that said, "What can you do for me?" "So, Alex," he said, swirling his scotch, "Melissa tells me you work in venture capital." "That's right, sir. Blackridge Partners. We specialize in restaurant and hospitality investments." His eyes lit up like I'd just told him I printed money in my basement. "Is that right? You know, I've always had a vision for a restaurant. Something classy, unique. The kind of place celebrities would talk about." Melissa squeezed my hand under the table. We'd discussed her father before, how he'd jumped from dream to dream for decades, never committing to anything. How he'd blamed everyone but himself for his failures. The economy. The government. Bad luck. The universe conspiring against him. "Dad's been talking about opening a restaurant since I was little," Melissa said, her tone gentle but edged with something like embarrassment. "He was a line cook at Delmonico's for a while." "Best damn line cook they ever had," Richard corrected, pointing his fork at us. "Would have been head chef if the owner's nephew hadn't swooped in and stolen my promotion." I nodded politely, but I'd already heard variations of this story from Melissa. There was always someone who stole Richard's chance, someone who cheated him out of what he deserved. "The system is rigged against guys like me," he continued, leaning forward. "All I need is one shot. One chance to prove what I can do." Later that night, as Melissa and I walked back to our apartment in Chelsea, she apologized. "He's not always like that. He's just stuck. Mom leaving really broke something in him." I pulled her close. "Everyone deserves a chance to reinvent themselves." I meant it. I believed in second chances. My own father had clawed his way from nothing to build a respectable accounting firm in Chicago. He'd taught me that hard work and perseverance could overcome almost anything. 6 months after our wedding, Melissa and I were having dinner at our place when she brought up her father again. "He's been evicted from his apartment," she said quietly. "He's staying with my aunt in Queens for now, but she doesn't have much space." I set down my fork. "What happened to his job at the car dealership?" "He said the manager had it out for him from day one." She didn't look up from her plate. "I know what you're thinking. It's the same old story." But seeing her worry about her father hurt me more than his excuses annoyed me. What if we helped him start that restaurant he's always talking about? Her head snapped up. "Alex, you can't be serious. He's been talking about that forever. It's just talk. Maybe he just needs someone to believe in him. Someone to give him structure." I reached for her hand. "I have connections with suppliers, real estate agents, investors. We could set everything up, make it foolproof." "With your money?" she asked skeptically. "An investment. We'd be partners. I'd own the building, he'd run the place. If it fails, at least we tried. And if it succeeds..." Hope flickered across her face. He might finally feel like he accomplished something. So began the most expensive mistake of my life. I found a location in a trendy part of Brooklyn that was just beginning to gentrify, low rent for now, but with huge potential. I bought the building outright, figuring it would be a solid investment regardless of whether the restaurant succeeded. Richard would pay rent, but at well below market rate. I pulled strings with suppliers I knew from my work. Called in favors from chefs who could consult on the menu. Hired a designer who'd worked on some of the most Instagram-worthy restaurants in the city. Called the project Foundry, a place where raw materials became something special. Richard was like a different person during those months of preparation. He was energetic, focused, bursting with ideas. He worked 16-hour days, tasting sauces, approving decor, interviewing staff. He called me son with genuine warmth. "You're the only one who ever believed in me," he told me one night as we sat in the half-finished dining room, surrounded by drop cloths and paint cans. Not even Melissa's mother thought I could pull something like this off. "Sometimes people just need the right opportunity," I said, feeling a swell of pride in what we were building together. The night Foundry opened, there was a line down the block. I'd used my connections to get a few influencers and a restaurant critic from the Times to attend. The food was exceptional. Richard had been modest about his culinary skills. The signature dish, a slow-roasted short rib with black truffle and bone marrow sauce, had people making reservations for return visits before they'd even finished their meals. Richard moved through the dining room like a king surveying his kingdom, shaking hands, accepting compliments. I watched from the bar, content to let him have his moment. Melissa squeezed my arm. "I've never seen him this happy. Thank you for this." The first year was a dream. Foundry became one of the hottest reservations in the city. Richard was featured in food magazines. There was talk of a cookbook. The investment was paying off handsomely, and more importantly, Richard seemed transformed. He stood taller. Laughed more freely. Stopped blaming the world for every minor setback. I was so busy with my own work at Blackridge that I let Richard handle the day-to-day operations. I'd stop by once a week or so, usually for dinner with Melissa, sometimes for a quick business check-in. Everything seemed perfect. Then came the first warning sign. I arrived for our monthly financial review to find Diane, our accountant, waiting alone in the office. "Richard had to step out," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Emergency with a supplier." "No problem. Let's go through the numbers." She hesitated. "Actually, Richard asked if we could reschedule. He said he wants to be here for these discussions going forward." Something cold settled in my stomach. "Diane, I'm a 50% owner of this business. I need to see the books." "I understand, but..." She fidgeted with her glasses. Richard was very clear. He said all financial matters go through him now. I called Richard immediately. Went straight to voicemail. I texted him, "We need to talk. Now." 3 hours later, he finally called back. "Sorry about that, son. Crazy day. Seafood supplier trying to pawn off some questionable scallops on us. Richard, Diane wouldn't show me the books." A pause. "Right, about that. I'm making some changes to how we run things. Streamlining. Too many cooks, you know. I'm not a cook. I'm your business partner. Your investor. And I appreciate that. I do. But the restaurant's established now. Time for me to take the reins fully. You've got your fancy investment job. You don't need to worry about Foundry's day-to-day." The conversation ended with vague reassurances, but the knot in my stomach only tightened. That night, I told Melissa about the strange interaction. She frowned. "That doesn't sound like him. He worships you for giving him this chance. Something feels off. The books should be open to both of us." She squeezed my hand. "I'll talk to him. He's probably just feeling insecure, wanting to prove he can handle things himself." A week later, Richard invited us to dinner at Foundry. He had a private table set up in the back, the best wine already decanted. He seemed relaxed, jovial even, as he ordered for all of us without consulting the menu. The chef's testing a new duck confit. You're going to love it. We chatted about nothing, the weather, a movie Melissa and I had seen, a celebrity who'd dined at Foundry the previous night. When dessert arrived, Richard cleared his throat. I've been doing some thinking about the future of Foundry. I set down my fork. Me too, actually. I think we need to discuss. I think it's time for you to step away from the business, he said, cutting me off. The words hung in the air like smoke. What? Melissa asked, her voice small. Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. Alex has been crucial in getting us off the ground. No question. But Foundry is established now. It's time for it to be a true family business. I stared at him. I'm family. He waved his hand dismissively. You know what I mean. Blood family. Keller family. This is my legacy to Melissa, to any grandchildren you two might give me. Dad, Melissa said, her face flushing, Alex is my husband. He is family. Of course, sweetheart. But in business terms, it's cleaner this way. He turned to me. I'm prepared to buy you out. Fair market value for your investment. My jaw clenched. Richard, I own the building. You're paying me rent that's well below market rate. I set up all the supplier relationships. I brought in the customers, the press. This is as much my restaurant as it is yours. His expression hardened. Money isn't everything, son. I've been in the trenches every day, building something special. You've been, what, an occasional visitor? A checkbook? Dad. Melissa looked horrified. It's okay, I said quietly. I want to hear what Richard has to say. He leaned forward. Look, Alex. You're a wealthy guy. This restaurant isn't going to make or break you. But for me? This is all I have. This is my one shot at leaving something behind. His voice softened, taking on a pleading quality. Haven't you ever wanted to be more than just a rich man's son? To build something with your own hands? It was a masterful manipulation, appealing to my own insecurities, my own desire to be self-made like my father. For a moment, I almost fell for it. So you're saying you want me to just walk away? From my investment? From the business I helped create? I'm offering to buy you out. At what valuation? And with what money, Richard? Last I checked, Foundry's profits were healthy but not enough to cover my initial investment. A flicker of something, annoyance, maybe, or guilt, crossed his face. I've secured additional funding. From who? That's not your concern. Melissa reached for my hand under the table. I could feel her trembling. I think we need time to consider this, I said, standing up. This is a big decision. Richard's smile returned, confident now. Of course. Take all the time you need. He raised his wine glass. To family. The drive home was silent. When we arrived at our apartment, Melissa finally broke down. I can't believe he would do this. After everything you've done for him. I held her as she cried, my mind already racing ahead, weighing options, formulating plans. The next morning, I made some calls. By afternoon, I knew that Richard had approached a local restaurant group about selling them a stake in Foundry. He'd represented himself as the sole owner. When I confronted him by phone, he didn't even deny it. This is my restaurant, he said, all pretense of friendliness gone. You were a means to an end. I'm a 50% owner on paper, I reminded him. Papers can be changed. He chuckled. You really think I've been sitting idle this past year? I've been planning for this since day one. I just needed to establish the restaurant's reputation first. Make it valuable. So the Grateful Father-in-Law Act was just that, an act. Business is business, son. Nothing personal. I hung up, a cold rage settling in my bones. It wasn't about the money, though that was substantial. It wasn't even about the betrayal, as vicious as it was. It was about justice. About consequences. Richard had miscalculated badly. He thought I would roll over because of Melissa, because of family politics. He didn't understand who he was dealing with. I hired a forensic accountant to go through every transaction Foundry had made since opening. I had copies of the original books, and through some discreet inquiries, gained access to the current financials. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Richard had been skimming profits for months, funneling money into a separate account. He'd been paying personal expenses through the business, a new car, a luxury apartment, lavish trips that had nothing to do with restaurant research. And he'd been paying himself a salary far beyond what we'd agreed upon. More damningly, he'd been avoiding taxes through an elaborate scheme that would put him squarely in the IRS's crosshairs once exposed. I met with my attorney to review my options. The building was mine, and the lease agreement was ironclad. The business partnership agreement gave me extensive rights. But I wanted more than legal victory. I wanted Richard to feel the same sense of betrayal, the same shock, that I had experienced. For 3 months, I said nothing. I attended family dinners at Foundry, smiled at Richard across the table, toasted his success. I watched him preen and boast about his achievement. All the while, I was setting the board for checkmate. Richard planned a special event to celebrate Foundry's 1-year anniversary. He invited food critics, local celebrities, influencers. He had promotional materials printed that referred to him as founder and owner, my name conspicuously absent. The party was scheduled for a Saturday night, when a feature about Richard Keller's culinary empire would be published in New York Magazine. The Tuesday before the event, I made my move. First, I contacted all of Foundry's suppliers and cancelled their contracts, citing fraud investigation. Then I had my attorney notify the restaurant group that was planning to invest that Richard was not the sole owner and was under investigation for financial improprieties. Finally, I sent a detailed report of my findings to the IRS. On Wednesday, I terminated the lease, effective immediately, citing numerous violations that Richard's increasingly sloppy management had accumulated. I had the locks changed while Richard was at a lunch meeting with his potential investors who never showed up. When Richard returned to find himself locked out of his own restaurant, he called me in a rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing? I have customers coming tonight." "The restaurant is closed for renovations," I said calmly. "Indefinitely. You can't do this. I have rights." "Actually, Richard, I can. And I have. Check your email. You'll find notice of lease termination, dissolution of our partnership, and some interesting correspondence with the IRS that I've copied you on." There was a long silence. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its bluster. "Listen, Alex, we can work this out. I was hasty before. Stressed from running the place. We can renegotiate. Like you said, Richard. Business is business." I hung up. That night, Melissa and I had a long, painful conversation. She was torn between loyalty to her father and her disgust at what he'd done. In the end, she said something that solidified my resolve. "He's been doing this his whole life. Blaming others, taking shortcuts, burning bridges. Maybe it's time he faced consequences." The next day, Richard arrived at our apartment, unannounced. He looked disheveled, desperate. "You've ruined me," he said when I opened the door. "The investors pulled out. The suppliers won't talk to me. The IRS is asking questions. You ruined yourself, Richard. I just revealed what you'd done. I'll sue you. I'll tell everyone how you sabotaged a family business out of spite." I smiled. "Go ahead. The books tell a pretty clear story. So do the witness statements from the staff about how you talked about me when I wasn't around. How you planned this from the beginning. His face crumpled. For a moment, I saw the man beneath the manipulation, small, frightened, eternally convinced of his own victimhood. What am I supposed to do now? He asked, his voice breaking. I considered him for a long moment. Start over. Honestly this time. I closed the door. 3 months later, Foundry reopened under new management, mine. I hired a talented chef who'd been working as a sous chef at a Michelin-starred restaurant downtown. Redesigned the space. Refined the menu. The new Foundry quickly eclipsed the old one in popularity and praise. Richard tried to open another restaurant in Queens, using what connections he had left. It closed within 6 months. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about how things might have been different. If Richard had been honest, we could have built something lasting together. A true family legacy. But I don't regret what I did. In the world of business, respect is everything. Trust is everything. Richard thought he could take what wasn't his without consequences. He was wrong. The last I heard, he was working as a line cook again, back where he started. Sometimes there's justice in coming full circle. As for me and Melissa, we're expecting our first child next spring. A daughter. We're not naming her after anyone in the family. Some cycles need to be broken. And every morning, when I walk past Foundry on my way to the office, I think about choices, and consequences, and the fine line between justice and revenge. I wonder if there's a difference at all.